Early.
It's the first time for everything.
All right.
All right. Good afternoon, y'all. Welcome to the third installment of Changing Ourselves to Change the World, a transformative conversation series hosted by Visionary Organizing Lab, hosted here via Facebook Live. My name is Matt Birkhold. I'm the director slash, I guess, founder of Visionary Organizing Lab. It's a collective effort founded by a brother named Sean Whitehorn, myself, and the wonderful woman here with me today, Amaka Okechukwu, a handful of years ago. And it's evolved into what it's evolving as a mechanism to support people, to fulfill our desire to become more fully human by creating sustainable and dignity affirming economies, institutions, and cultural practices. And so our work here today is part of that, because it's part of supporting people in all of those areas. And today, we are blessed to have with us my favorite human being, Amaka Okechukwu, who is a wonderful human being. She is one of the smartest folks I know. You are in for a real treat today, because not only is she profoundly intelligent, but she is one of the most ethical people I know, politically ethical, socially ethical, and personally ethical. You know, she is not a joke. She is committed to doing the right things. And if you were with us last week, Adela Nieves Martinez asked me what I enjoyed about her. And one of the things I said was that she has a commitment to facing difficult truths, accepting them, and responding as though they are part of her reality. So you get a chance to be in conversation with her today and join our conversation. So thank you for taking the time to be with us, Amaka. And let's get started.
Thank you for having me. Um, I've enjoyed the previous conversations. And as I've told you earlier, this may look more like a conversation as opposed to an interview like the previous ones. But, we'll just see what the rhythm's looking like and, you know, see how it goes. But I'm happy to be here.
Happy you're here. Thank you.
We are in the same house, so it's actually kind of interesting in different rooms what this looks like. If the lag is, I think technology is fine, but anyway.
Yes. And so I will give the folks watching a disclaimer. I don't know if that's the right word, but if you've never been a part of a conversation with Amaka and I, or never observed us in conversation, at the very least, we can guarantee you some entertainment. And so here we go.
That's putting a lot on it. We'll see.
That's all right. Amaka, please tell us about who you are and what's important to you.
Okay. My name is Amaka Okechukwu. And what's important to me? I mean, I think that often shifts, has shifted over time. I think for me, lately, doing a lot of internal check-ins with myself has been a really important part of figuring out um, who I am in this moment and what's important to me. I think I go back and forth, but I was raised to have a deep love and respect of other people, of humanity, um, and it's important for me to be thinking with other people about how to um, build a better world, a more just world. And I think I've done that in a variety of ways. And sometimes it's easier than others. And, sometimes that collective of people is bigger than others. But I think that's been pretty consistent, like my recognition of the severe limitations of the world that I was born into and that I live in, and finding ways to improve that in some form or fashion.
Hmm. Thank you, Amaka. Are you able to speak to the process of how you came to understand the limitations and the potential, how did you come to understand the potential that the world could be different than it was?
I'm a Black woman, so I think you come to a realization pretty quickly in life that the world is very imperfect. Um, I think you, from just lived experience, you're able to, or I was able to observe the sort of deep injustices in the world. I was able, as a Black woman, to recognize, um, even in regards to the sort of opportunities and the advantages that I was given in life, um, seeing my position as different from other people who didn't have those same opportunities and advantages. And so I think from that point, I was able to really, just growing up, I was also raised in a very progressive, justice oriented church in Oakland. And so I think from a very young age, I was able to connect, um, sort of quest for justice and a better world, with a lived like religious practice. Um, and I think that was really important for my development because I didn't see, you know, I feel like I wasn't exposed to like really oppressive and reactionary Christianity until I was much older because of the church that I was raised in, and just the sort of progressive tendencies and the recognition of the importance of the Black church in prior movements like the civil rights movement. And so for me, I think those experiences allowed me to both understand and sort of view the world with a particular lens, right? Looking at the ways in which the world was just so um, oppressive and exploitative. But on the other hand, knowing that it was up to human beings to kind of come together to create something different and to demand for something else and to build that possibility for ourselves. Um, and so I think probably those kinds of experiences, I think had a, those were formative, right, in my development, in my early life, I think.
Okay. Thank you for that. So what I hear you saying is that your experience as a Black woman kind of demonstrated to you pretty early on that the world was not an ideal place, and that it was certainly not an ideal place for you, and hence therefore was not an ideal place, and that your relationship, or having grown up in a progressive justice oriented church, really played a role in you believing that something else was possible. Or you talked about the role of churches in the civil rights movement. I know your church was located in Oakland, California. Did your church have any specific relationships that were meaningful to you that you saw that may have played a role in your outlook on the possibility for a new world?
Yeah, I mean, I think I guess there's a few ways to answer that. I mean, I would say that growing, the sort of growing up in the kind of church that I grew up in played a formative role. It wasn't the only thing. I don't want to sort of harp on that. It was not the only thing. And I think
Mm-hmm.
I cite it as important in my development because I grew up in a very Christian family. But, um, being from Oakland, being from the Bay Area, being from a place with a particular um, movement history, right? Panthers and beyond. Um, I think some of that was also in the air as well. Um, my church was not isolationist in the sense that it just was a church. It had lots of relationships. And as most, I mean, I don't know what most churches do, but I think you're right. The idea is that churches are supposed to be spaces that serve the people, right? And so there were lots of relationships with other, of course, churches, other organizations. There were ministries sort of, extended in many different ways. So whether that be to feeding people, to taking care of sick people, right? In a really expansive AIDS ministry, like at a time, like in the 80s, for example, at a time at which a lot of the Black community wasn't really dealing with AIDS, for example. Um, so lots of ministries, lots of work in the community. And so I think that was important. But I think that, over time, over my lifetime, I think I came to an understanding about the sort of limitations of particular kinds of structures, right, to bring us the kind of world that we need. So I think growing up, I was like, in the church, and I wanted to, um, be like a civil rights attorney or, something along those lines, right? I had always really been engaged with the sort of the wrongness of all of the injustice and the inequality and finding ways to contribute. But from a young person's perspective, I think that could be probably best achieved through like the electoral system or, some more conventional routes, likely. Um, and I think over time, that became less important to me because I saw the sort of inherent limitations um, in the political system in this country, in the ways in which, I thought it was important for us to think not beyond in the sense that we don't need it and we don't have to engage it, because of course there's an argument for that. And, we absolutely need to get Trump or whomever, right, out of office right now. But, really thinking more through what are the kinds of structures that we can build for ourselves? What are the kinds of experiments that we could create on the ground that might be spaces for us to practice and to think about new ways of organizing um, society, social relations? What are ways that would, um, what are ways that could better serve um, people, right? Because it's the current system has been limited in doing that. And so, and I think, yeah, like I came to that over a lifetime. I had to go through a variety of organizations. I had to study, I had to be in a variety of political spaces to come to that. And so I think that was just, that developed right over a life course with, being at like, white private schools that I went to for like high school, and like the students of color sort of organizing in that space, to being an undergrad and being in, organizations like the NAACP, to from that to like being in artist collectives, to being in radical organizations, um, in a variety of locations, right? Oakland, Los Angeles, Brooklyn, right now being in DC. I think just that summation of all of that had, has led me to the point that I'm at right now in regards to like a political perspective, for sure.
Okay, thank you. And I really appreciate you talking about that being a process. And when I say that, what I mean is you coming to think beyond kind of the limitations of the limitations of electoral politics towards transforming the larger world. That process, coming to that process, and I think that when I first met you, I, and the good brother Calvin Williams, who I want to give I just want to send some love to. He had a loss this week, and just want to say we're thinking about you.
Yes.
But the three of us had dinner, and I remember it being a very profound conversation. And this is, I think it was 2000. 2010 or 11, 2011. It was 9 years ago, 2011. And at the time, and I remember being struck by the fact that the three of us were able to have what felt like a very significant conversation around the relationship of, you opened up this conversation with taking care of yourself, with your mental health, and in this moment of public health crisis. And the three of us had this conversation about the relationship between transforming ourselves, healing ourselves, and political transformation. And at the time, especially in New York City, there weren't a lot of people who believed that, and certainly weren't having that conversation. And I remember being struck, that seemed very significant. And
in the context also, right? We had came from a Grace Lee Boggs talk.
Yes.
Featuring Ruby D and a lot of other folks. But it was, Grace Lee Boggs was talking, and we ended up having a conversation afterwards. I think you remember the details of that conversation much better than I do, because my memory is awful.
That's all right. I don't remember them that well, but I remember the basic theme of the conversation. And thank you for mentioning that we had come from an event with Grace, where Grace talked about the need to transform ourselves and our institutions. And I want to ask if you have any insight into the process of how you came to understand that personal transformation, that there was a relationship between structural transformation, or the transformation of society, and the need to transform ourselves.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And it's hard for me to pinpoint like a particular moment, but I do think that it became clear to me at some point that, the ways in which we function in this world today, both sort of in movements and outside of movements, is still disciplined and sort of shaped by the dominant culture, which is one that is absolutely influenced and sort of, a product of, sort of capitalist logics, right? And so for me, it was important to recognize that, to some degree, um, even in these sort of radical movements, let's say that we win tomorrow, which would, wonderful. Um, in what ways would how would our treatment of each other and our treatment of ourselves differ, right? Even if we sort of reorganize, economics, for example, right? Reorganize the social relations, right? It's like, how would things really differ? And I think from my experience in a variety of movement spaces that were like important and necessary for my political development, but I just still saw like the way that people treated each other in those spaces in ways that were like really oppressive and nasty and horrible. I knew that, I knew that I didn't want to, if there was a way to sort of think more critically about how we have to change ourselves, that would be an important component to thinking about a new world. I don't think it's possible for us to, everyone to sort of be these perfect people to create something anew, but I do think it's part of our work to sort of consider, right, the ways in which these systems have damaged us and have sort of shaped our, behavior and our responses and our reactions and the way that we do things, and to think more critically about what it would look like to practice something else. Mm-hmm. And that's, that can be a variety of ways. I think it can be both really sort of abstract and very concrete in regards to just right? How people could be relating to each other differently. And so I think, it was also the moment, right, at which I was sort of discovering like Grace and Jimmy Boggs's work around that time that we went to that talk. And I think part of why I likely found it at that time was that I was open, to sort of thinking differently or to sort of, um, you know, making changes, I guess, in the ways that I was moving, right, in organizations. And I think I have come up against limitations of, a variety of organizations at the time. And while recognizing like the good and like the really important work that folks were doing, recognizing that, you know, my heart wasn't really in a lot of those spaces. I had kind of drifted off because it really wasn't speaking to this other part of myself. Um, and so I think I probably came across that work at that time for that, for a very specific reason, I guess, in that regard. Um, yeah, hope that it partially answers that question.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what I hear you saying is that in some ways you had seen amongst people who not just believed that a different kind of world was necessary, but were actually active in organizations and involved in activities to do that, who had assumed responsibility for transforming the world to some degree. You saw them behave, and I think you used the word oppressive. You saw them behave in ways that mimicked the
Yes.
world that they sought to transform.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. I mean, yeah, I mean, I think for me that was the first piece of it. I think I had also just, unpopular opinion. Like I had sort of become desensitized from the sort of popular modes of engagement, right? So it's activists, right? Rallies, protests, like, unpopular opinion, but I really hate those spaces. Like I I have long uh grown numb to those kinds of experiences. I see the utility, so it's not like I don't think that they're fine, and I think they can do a lot in regards to gathering people, sort of igniting a spark in people. And I think it's really important to sort of have these collective spaces where people can sort of articulate grievances in particular ways. But for me, it began to feel like an incredibly disempowering experience going to a protest or a rally, in regards to how, people were making demands. So this idea of, demanding someone else to do something. And of course, that's necessary. I'm not sort of, I understand a variety of tactics and strategies. But for me, I was like, and maybe this appealed more to the sort of creative side of myself. For me, I was like, are there other ways that we can sort of intervene and sort of shift things without having to demand things on other people, right? Like, or demand things on authorities in particular, who we know to be largely morally bankrupt, right? And so for me, I was like, yo, how, is there anything else that we can do? Like, what does it look to like build your own structures, your own experiments in different kinds of worlds? Um, what does it look like to try to build self-sustaining structures? That became more interesting to me. Not to say that I've been like wholly successful in doing that, in my own, but I became more interested in sort of building with folks who were and like figuring out, thinking through issues around building the smaller experiments, issues of scalability, like how do we do, this experiment or this thing works in this place. Would it work in this other place? Why not? Like those sorts of things, because I just found them to be more empowering to a certain extent. Certainly more responsibility, but I think absolutely more empowering, right, for where I was in my political development. So, all that to say, like, if y'all invite me to a rally or a protest, I'm not saying I'm not going to come, but they're just not my favorite form of political engagement.
Thank you for that. And I'll share that. Several years ago, you said this offhand, but it had struck me as a very, very important remark. And we were in the midst of some conversation, and you said, how disempowering is it to get all angry about something and then go ask someone else to fix it for you?
Yeah, and then Grace made me write an article about it.
So I want to ask something else that I think builds off. You've created an excellent segue into this next question that I have for you. And my favorite part of Facebook is the memories, mostly because I get to laugh at foolish things I did several years ago with other people. But I happened to come across a quote that I had shared, and it wasn't attributed to anybody. But the quote was that you are personally responsible for becoming more ethical than the society you grew up in. Mm-hmm. I'm gonna read that once more. You are personally responsible for becoming more ethical than the society you grew up in. And I wonder what that might mean to you.
I mean, I identify with that. I think that, again, particularly if we're thinking about American society, right? Deeply unethical, dishonest, morally bankrupt, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that, of course, we all have different sort of values and more, different systems of values and morals. But I think that, this idea of personal responsibility in a way that's empowering, right? In a way that's about sort of your own journey, your own, sort of figuring out who you are and and what your values are, and connecting with other people, right? So the collective is still important. So I think that like this idea of like you are personally responsible of sort of, building this ethical society. I don't remember the direct quote. I'm sorry, I misquoted you, but I think generally for me, what that brings up is our ideas around self-determination and ideas around sort of, what Jimmy would say, and I don't know a direct quote, but just sort of the general idea around we have to be sort of responsible to govern, essentially, like as activists or as revolutionaries, he would say, right? It's like we have to get to the position where we would be sort of responsible to do that, to govern, because who, if the ideas of other people are not doing it right, then who is the one to do it right and to organize things differently? So yeah, I mean, I think I do agree with that quote to a certain extent. I mean, what is your thought? What are your thoughts? What are your inroads into that particular statement? Why did that stand out to you to bring it here?
I'm gonna read it once more. You are personally responsible for becoming more ethical than the society you grew up in. And I think I love the way that you drew a bridge between being personally responsible and that being a need for that to also be a collective process or exercise. And I think that the quote speaks to me because I mean, I have seen folks similar to you. I have seen folks who were committed. Their commitment to creating a new world was beyond question. They were.
Right.
These were folks who sacrificed, who worked hard, and did so for the people. But also had horrible relationships with their children.
Right.
And treated people poorly. Um, I several years ago, probably 15, 16 years ago, before Manning Marable's book on Malcolm X came out, um, he was giving a talk in Philadelphia at a Holiday Inn or something. Um, very random thing. And I was there at the talk. And over the course of his discussion, and I don't believe this came into the book. Like I don't believe this made it into the book that Manning wrote, but he talked about the moment at which, you know, their family's house in Queens is bombed. And, there are reports of Betty and Malcolm arguing back and forth in the street. And Malcolm gets on a flight to go to Detroit the next day. And Manning raises this question, because for me, I was very familiar with that story before
Mm-hmm.
talk. And for me, I'd always said, man, my interpretation up to that point was, that's commitment. That is what commitment to struggle looks like. That is what commitment to building a new world looks like. That is the embodiment of revolutionary commitment. And Manning says very boldly, we have to ask if that was neglect. And it was as if, I mean, it was the question that I didn't know was in me to ask.
Right.
And so I think that it symbolized a moment for me to prioritize what was ethical over what was politically right or politically correct, and not in the usage that, not in the ridiculous language that the right uses around politically correct, but politically accurate, if you will.
Right. And that can be extended to a variety of activists and leaders and figures, right? These
Yeah.
stories, right? People that have been martyred, right? And even those who haven't, right? Like
Yeah.
this sort of the sacrificial um, relationship, right? That they give themselves to the people as opposed to their own people, like their family, right? Their own people. And I'm not necessarily making a judgment on those particular figures in regards to
Mm-hmm.
that, but I do think it does raise questions. And I think, particularly when we talk about male activists, right, this is also maybe a gender question because, when we think about the role of like women historically in movements. And I even think about, what was that panel that we organized many years ago together at the Breck Forum that was related to like motherhood and movements. And right, the idea of, when women do this work, they bring their kids, right? Like the kids are at the meeting or they're wherever. It becomes part of the family's work essentially, as opposed to, in a lot of situations with male spokespersons kind of thing. But yeah, I mean, it does raise really important questions because that for me is a question about, in some ways, like how we sort of socially organize like movement spaces, like who can be there, who was welcome, like what roles are available, are they reserved for particular people, like those sorts of things. um, and so yeah, I mean, I think that raises like really important questions.
Well, and I think that there was right. So in addition to this question of who has access to spaces and in the families, like it really forced me
Is somebody
to hold on. Let me shut the window. I think they building a house next door. Hold on. I was hoping you could hear me. Hold on.
It's so funny because I can't hear it and we're in the same house, but he's in a different place.
Sorry about that.
What's up, y'all? I'm seeing your comments. It's very disorienting doing this on Zoom and then looking at the Facebook comments, but we see y'all and we're hoping that you ask us some really good questions and comments for later.
Thank you for that, Amaka. And so I think that in addition to me around this question of, in addition to the question of families and so forth, because that is where it hit me first. I think I also began to, I asked you the question about being responsible, being personally responsible, becoming more ethical than the society that raised you, and you talked about this country's moral bankruptcy, moral deficiency, and just lack of. For years, I had lamented. I remember I was getting a master's degree, and I was in a feminist philosophy class, and it was all European philosophy, and there was a discussion of ethics. And I remember saying out loud, "What business does any European have to talk about ethics?" And I was young and obnoxious at the time, but there was still there's a kernel of truth there. Like, I mean, that European society has been entirely built on the genocide of indigenous folks to Latin America, the enslavement and colonization of Africans, and the enslavement and colonization of Asians. And on that basis, articulated moral philosophy and a quote unquote science of ethics.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that for me, on one hand, it meant that the whole question of European society was, where the whole concept of European society was morally bankrupt and dishonest and completely out of line with what it proclaimed to be. And I think that in that quote around becoming more ethically responsible than the society in which I was raised, I see a chance to capture and further an ethical and honest and loving opportunity to articulate what it means to be a human being, to define what a good society looks like.
For sure.
And that to me, I think is collectively. And I think that for me, I might change the quote to say, collectively, we are personally responsible.
Right.
For becoming more ethical than the society that has reared us.
What do you think? I mean, there's so many, but because I agree with you, the particular challenges of this moment to realizing that.
I'm laughing because that was the next question I had for you.
Well, can't have two interviewers in and we can both, talk about that, but I think that's that's always been the case. And I think that at this moment, with this sort of deepening crisis that is going to get even deeper, and at a moment where, beyond the sort of just, the social and the economic and the political, but also the environmental, how do you see the sort of, I guess, both the challenges but the possibilities, right, in this moment?
Mm-hmm. I think that beginning with the financial crisis of 2008, I think that 50 years from now, we'll look back on this moment of pandemic and economic crisis and environmental crisis, and so on and so forth, and see that around 2008, we entered a period of questioning. I will never, and I learned that I was living in upstate New York during the crisis, and I was in a laundromat with an older white gentleman who had spent his entire life upstate New York. And somehow we began talking. And this gentleman and I shared nothing in common, socially, politically,
Right.
at all. And somehow, over the course of the conversation, through whatever questions I was asking him, he began to say, it seems to me that what used to work really well no longer does.
Mm-hmm.
And I share that because it helped me understand that people change on their own time, and they do so in relationship to the conditions that they find themselves in.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think the nature of deepening crisis since 2008 means that more people are are raising the question of what happened.
Mm-hmm.
And I think to the degree that people raise the question of what happened, people become open to new ways of asking and thinking about and being open to what's next.
Mm-hmm.
Uh,
Yeah, I mean, I think that the critical mass of people coming to that is important because when we talk about crisis and a sort of deepening crisis, I think it's important to sort of acknowledge that for those marginalized people, right, we've always been in crisis.
mm-hmm.
It's just, when we're referring to crisis, it's really a crisis of, to some extent, like the wealthy and the sort of, the shaky um, infrastructure of this system, right? That has always been on shaky ground, right? It's just becoming clear to more than the marginalized folks that this is shaky, and it's we don't know how much longer we could still hold this thing up. Um, but I think it's important of a critical mass of people sort of recognizing that shakiness because with there is the possibility, right? And with there is the um when people are questioning or saying this doesn't look right, um that's when it's folks like us or whomever to come in and say, well, look, how about this other way of doing things, or right, there may be these other ways of meeting our needs um that are not dependent on this shaky structure,
Mm-hmm.
you know. And so I think this is a critical point for all of us in that regard. Of course, scary and uncertain. Um, of course, with that uncertainty, it's hard to like plan and be able to project and be able to calculate. I mean, that's the thing right now. It's like, with all of whether it be the media or whomever, right? We have all of these forecasts of what could happen, but no one knows. And I think that, with that, it allows us some time to think about what else could we do, you know?
That's real. Thank you. How how do you understand this moment of crisis that we're in? I mean, it's on, it becomes increasingly clear, right? Say 6 months ago, since Naomi Klein's book, This Changes Everything, came out. But long before that, but since that book came out, it became increasingly clear to increasingly numbers of people that we could either, that due to the capitalist economic system's reliance on fossil fuels, we had a choice to make between survival or capitalism. As this COVID-19 pandemic has grown, and the question of reopening the economy and sacrificing and the contradiction between that and human survival, we now are experiencing, like, it's clear that we can choose between survival or patriarchal racial capitalism, survival or economic growth, on two fronts, both the climate and public health. What's that tell you? What does that tell you anything about the nature of this moment of crisis we're in? Is this different than something we've experienced before?
I think that we, of course, can draw parallels to previous time periods, but I think that, this moment is particularly unique in the sense of, if we even compare, like, for example, the economic crash that we're going through and about to go through to, let's say, the Great Depression, for example. Of course, easy parallel, right? Lots of folks on the radio and whatever will always bring it back to that point, or 2008, right? These big economic crashes, to draw parallels and similarities. But if we think about the ways in which, right, the ways in which our economy is interdependent and embedded in a world system, in a world economy, which, world systems theorists would tell us this has always been somewhat the case. But, right, the idea that was consequential in another, something that happens in another part of the world is consequential for the working class here in the United States, right? I think that is different than some of the Great Depression, though I'm sure historians might be able to get at me in the comments. But so that's a piece that I think is different. The extent of financialization, right? And the amount of wealth, right? There is literally more wealth and more money and more capital, all that stuff. There's more of it to lose now than there was before. If we think about the quote unquote standard of living, right, in this country has greatly increased since that of the Great Depression. During the Great Depression, there wasn't really a middle class in this country, right? So the idea that, everyone thinks that they're middle class now, which is a whole other farce that we have to deal with. But, in that sense, right, the average, this idea that there is more, in some ways more to lose now, in terms of, like, quote unquote quality of life and those sorts of things. But so, like, there's little things like that I can think of, that sort of distinguish, like, the past from the present. But I do think that, the extent of sort of environmental um, deterioration, all right, in the ways that's become clear to everyone, I think is different than it was then. Like, these are real questions about human survival, and not just in regards to sort of economic livelihood, which is the conversation that we keep hearing on the news. And what is it, the Texas governor talking about he's willing to sacrifice himself if his grandkids could have a good quality of life, or whatever the case is. Like, his grandkids gonna have a good quality of life regardless, but whatever. Right, like, the idea that um, you know with the fires in California and Australia, with, the variety of environmental disaster and catastrophe that's occurring, in relationship to climate change, and just the poor way that we treat the environment. I mean, there are real questions of, the world is not sustainable. This may mean literally the end of humanity. And I don't mean that in like a, trying to depress in this sort of dystopic vision. I mean, it's just the warning signs are there. Scientists have been telling us what this means. And so I do think that is particularly different from that prior period as well. So I think that there's lots of important differences. And so what that means is that the stakes are higher now. It means that this is not just about recovering for, the livelihood of your children or whatever. This is about a different path forward, a different way of living, a different way of social organization, a different way moving forward. And again, I don't know what that means or what that could look like. Things could absolutely get worse, but I think that there's an opportunity for things to be better by, better meeting people's needs and better recognizing people's humanity and the value of human beings and what they have to contribute to this, to a different kind of world and different kind of living. But I think we have to be open to that. Like, I think we have to become open to that. I think we have to be willing to like let go of certain things in order for that to happen, certain commodities and those sorts of things, and to be better opened up for it. So it's not going to be an easy process, but I think we're being forced into it and forced to be thinking differently about it, for sure.
So what I hear you saying, Amaka, is that it's plausible that there are, if we think about the economy in isolation of other factors, it's plausible that we're in a kind of moment that is similar to 2008 or 1929. And economists think of the economy in isolation of other factors. But
the media as well. I mean, that's how people are reporting on this, right? Because I don't think people have a real language or framework to think about, no, this is like a new era. You know what I'm saying? Like, I don't think people can really wrap their heads around that. And I think, again, that's related to the uncertainty. There's nothing to sort of compare it to or whatever. That doesn't mean that we don't use the sort of skills and the knowledge and the histories and, the information that we have and that we know. That doesn't mean that we don't use that in thinking through the next piece. That's what we have. So we work with what we have, and we work with our creativity, our, human capacity for, thinking up something else, right? But yeah, I think it's hard for people to think that this may be a complete, sea change in regards to how we move forward and how we function and how we are, be with each other, right? And yeah.
Thank you. Okay, and so what I hear you saying now is that because the economy doesn't function in isolation of, say, the environment or public health, it's not what human beings experienced in the 1920s or the 1870s or 2008. It is actually a moment where we can't go back to where we were.
Absolutely. There is no turning back. There is no turning back from this. There's no way.
And if that's the case, which I believe it is, what might it mean to respond to this crisis in ways that collectively assume responsibility for becoming more ethical than the world that reared us?
I mean, that's a big question, right? That's what is to be done
yes.
question, right? But I think that, like, we have to find ways to draw on our collective capacity and our collective creativity. And I think that's difficult at a time where we're afraid to be in space with each other. So I think we have to be creative, find ways to do it digitally and, through whatever ways. It may even be old school, pen and paper, who knows? But I think we have to find out ways to draw on that, like, collective creative capacity for sure, to think through this, because I don't have an answer, and I don't know if any one person has an answer about our way through this, because there are the very real, there's this question of possibility that I've been raising, and our ability to build something else. And there's also the very real concrete material conditions in regards to the fact that people need to eat, right? And people need to sustain themselves in some way to make it from day to day. And so I think we have to be creative in sort of finding a bridge, right, between those sort of concrete material conditions and the possibilities of something else. Um, because we need both. And I think so much of even our organizing, if we talk about organizing culture and all of that, and the ways in which campaigns are developed and everything else, it's about meeting that first part, right? Folks' material, concrete needs, which is absolutely important, because we're not doing that in this country, and we never have done that in this country. Meeting folks' material needs without thinking about the possibilities. Um, and I think that has done us a great disservice, in our movements, and not thinking more about, well, what could this world look like, right? What could we build here? What would we want to build here? In an ideal world, right? This question about in an ideal world is not a silly exercise. And I have been in movements where people treat it as a silly exercise. We don't have time to be dealing with this dreaming stuff, right? But it's like, well, why are we here? You know? And we, of course, have to be creative, right? And sort of knowing that if we do have that ideal place on the table, that we're not going to get there tomorrow. We may not get there in our lifetime. But I think we still need to be actively thinking about building that and working towards that. I just feel like it's incredibly necessary. But I think we often have sacrificed that piece for just meeting the material needs, because it's hard. Because it's, again, when have we met everyone's material needs ever in this country? But yeah, I think for me, it's important to just really consider both of those pieces.
So kind of what I hear you saying is that if we collectively are to assume responsibility for becoming more ethical and creating a more ethical world than that which reared us, in a crisis like this, collectively, human beings have to wrap our heads around the question both of how do people actually have food, housing, how do they feel safe, these immediate needs, while also raising the question and developing a vision for what a world beyond this one might look like. Am I hearing you correctly?
For sure. Yeah, absolutely. And maybe we'd be better prepared for this moment if we had been prioritizing thinking about that next piece, right? What could we have? What could we build? What would a different world look like? I'm not saying that people haven't. There are plenty of organizations and movements and collectives of people that do this, absolutely. But in the age of wrangling with the nonprofit industrial complex, there's not a space for us to think outside of those boundaries. And I think that's, that kind of the disciplining that has done has been very damaging, I think. And so yeah, yeah, but that's, yes, you summarized my thoughts well in that regard.
I want to ask you to build on that, if you don't mind. And I think in particular, what I want to ask about, the phrase that you used was collective capacity and creativity. And the fact that, developing a vision involves creativity and capacity. I want to ask you to speak to the importance of Black leadership in that process. Why is Black leadership important to that process? Yeah, let me start there. Why is Black leadership important to that process?
I mean, I think there's a variety of ways into that question, but I think historically, right, when we think about what Black people have faced, what they've been up against in this country, and what they've been able to do, I think that there are particular insights and practices from Black communities that would be probably useful in thinking us through something else. And I think of that in regards to, if we could dream ourselves out of slavery, we can dream ourselves out of this moment as well,
Mm.
right? And so I think that there is something there, absolutely. Um, I think in the age of diversity, we have to be critical about who those people, the kind of, Black leaders who those people claim, people that claim to be leaders who are mainly running out of self-interest. I'm generally very bored with charismatic leaders as a as a concept, as a role. But for those of you that are moved by that, like, I think we generally have to be very critical of those people. But I think generally, if we sort of draw from the kinds of traditions and rituals and practices that Black people have had to use over time to, um, you know, keep us keep ourselves alive and keep ourselves fighting. Um, right? I think that there are particular insights there that may be useful in or that are necessary, right, in thinking through a new world. So it is the dreaming ourselves out of oppression, and then working to do that, not just the dreaming, but the work. But it is in the resistance specifically, to be specific. Um, but it is also the sort of adage of making a way out of no way, right? If we think, if we can't see our way out of this, right? Um, making a way out of no way is something that we gonna have to do, right, to get to the next space. And so I think that, um, right, those sorts of imperatives are, um, particularly important for us as we think through the next step. And I think it's something that we, can point to numerous historical examples of Black people doing that. But I think, it's also the case for other kinds of marginalized groups as well, right? Um, when we're given scraps, what do we do with it, right? And we can do a lot with scraps, to be honest. Um, Lots of ingenuity. We deserve more, absolutely. But dealing with the reality and then creating a possibility out of that is definitely part of the Black radical tradition.
Right. Thank you for that. And in part, what I hear you saying is that Black creativity and capacity is important towards or for resolving this current world scale crisis in ethical ways because the reality, the material reality of being Black in the United States has meant, that Black folks have historically and consistently been forced to make a way out of no way. And there's been a capacity specific to Black folks. I mean, the quote that you used to quote you was, if we could dream our way out of slavery, we can dream our way out of this. And the vision that you spoke to, the vision that you spoke to earlier in the conversation that was necessary and practical at this moment. I believe what you said was, if we had spent more time developing a vision in the past, we might not be where we are right now. And so I hear what you're talking about is Black leadership is vital towards moving from this crisis towards a new path, both because of the historical consistency of what might be called a Black radical imagination and Black people's material history of making ways out of no way. I want to ask, and this popped into my head as you were talking, and you've referenced James Boggs a couple times, and I think that what popped into my head was, and I don't remember if this comes out of the Manifesto for a Black Revolutionary Party that he wrote, or if it was in an essay called The American Revolution, Putting Politics in Command, where he took a position that was similar to you around the importance of a vision, to resolve the crisis and chaos that was inherent to every society, in the period or the era of the late 1960s and early 70s. And he would say that the Black movement had to assume leadership for the whole country, not just for the Black community. Um,
Yeah.
I hear you say, yeah. Can you say a little more? What do you mean? Yeah, what's that mean to you today? Does that have any relevance to you today? Is that a useful way to
I
think?
mean, we're gonna have to lead. I mean, we would have to take on leadership for the whole country because we don't exist in isolation of other folks, right? So it's like if we were, and this is, again, I've had a long sort of history of moving through different movements and tendencies and ideologies. So if we think of like, right, um, the five-state solution or something like that, right? Thinking of Black nationalist politics and this idea of what was it, taking the five southerns? I don't remember all the specific five states. Y'all nationalists, y'all can get on me in the comments. What was it? Louisiana,
Yeah,
Mississippi,
Alabama,
Louisiana, Alabama, Georgia.
South Carolina.
Is that what the five states? But right, this idea that as Black nationalists, right, we give us those states and we could just be in those states, relocate and govern ourselves accordingly. And I think that there's clear limits to that in many, many, many different ways. But if we think about, in this moment, right, we don't exist in isolation. As Americans, we don't exist in isolation from the rest of the world. As Black people in this country, we don't exist in isolation from the rest of society. And so if Jimmy is talking about this idea of Black people have to assume leadership for everyone, in order for us to be good, in order for us to have our needs taken care of and to create the world that we want to live in, that everyone would be involved. Everyone would essentially be involved in that project in terms of Black leadership taking over, right? That being at the lead of that. It's similar to how you could think of like, Kambahi or, other Black feminist collectives, in talking about, right, if you meet the needs of those that are most oppressed, then everyone's needs will be met, right? And so yeah, I mean, I think that that's true in this context. I don't think that that means Black leadership in isolation from other, if we're dealing with other countries and, the tendencies or whatever in this country. It's important to consider that as well. But, if we're going back to this idea of the sort of collective creative capacity, I think it absolutely requires, you know, in the context of this conversation, I think it requires thinking about Black leadership of everybody. And again, I don't mean it in the sense of particular charismatic leaders. Leave Obama in retirement. I don't need to see him again. I really don't, right? This is not about sort of, electoral office and people being elected to president, those sorts of things. Again, very, we do need to get the jokers that are in office out right now because it's awful. But I think the type of crisis that we're in is going to go beyond that of, negotiating over electoral college votes, right? And I think people are, really starting to understand that. I'm hopefully starting to understand that. So yeah, I mean, so that's how I would sort of answer that particular question.
Thank you for that. And I wanna ask folks to put their questions in the comments, and I want to ask Amaka one more and get back to everybody's questions after this one. Um, and Amaka, I really appreciate your thoughtfulness around this question of Black folks and creativity and leadership. And I want to ask, um, and this is not a question that I'm asking specific to Black leadership, but I think if we're talking about recognizing that we can't go back and that therefore we have to move forward in a different way, and that a vision is necessary, and that what's required of us is to develop a vision for how people might get our needs met in the forward, I'm sorry, in the future, as well as how people get their needs met today. That's a very different approach to that's a very different approach to trying to transform the world than has historically been common in this country. And so I wonder if you might speak to what's required, if you have any insights into what's required of leadership for that kind of thinking and acting, that kind of organizing.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think, and I don't know the answer to it, but the first thing that comes to mind is accountability, being accountable to the most marginalized person, people. Um, that's something that comes to mind. I think that being able to cultivate people's creative capacity
Mm.
is really important as well. Um, right. I think that artists and folks that um, do this creative work and do this thinking and commit themselves to this thinking are should be integral pieces of this when we think about moving forward, because these are the folks that are in tune with themselves enough to create in that kind of way. And so I do think that, we have to think about the role of artists and culture and moving forward, because I think they'll have an integral role. Um, I think that I don't know. That's a great question. I think it will require a lot. I think it would require, again, thinking beyond a sort of charismatic leader role, thinking more about what leadership is and what it looks like, and the role of leaders again is in really sort of cultivating folks' creative capacity and their ability to um, think and do things, and making folks feel empowered. Um, I think is certainly part of responsibility of a leader. And so, what that might look like, if we scale that up, what does that look like? I don't know. I mean, I think that looks like a variety of things. It probably looks like an education system that actually educates and, um, gives folks uh, a kind of hope or possibility. Um, yeah, it means a lot of things. I don't think there's any one answer to that, but I think these are important questions that we have to keep asking ourselves and asking leaders, and things that we should be, attuned to as we move through whatever this is to the next stage.
Thank you. Do you have any thoughts on the role of love in resolving this crisis?
Do you have thoughts on the roles and resolving this crisis? I mean, I think, right, the ability for folks to, um, right, this accountability question, I think is tied to love, right? Love is not, romance and skipping in the sunshine, right? It's accountability, it's trust, it's the ability to be vulnerable, right? And I think, we have to sort of seriously consider those elements moving forward as well, in terms of trusting each other and being able to be vulnerable with each other, but also building modes of accountability, because harm is inevitable. It will happen. That is human nature and behavior. And so, how do we build accountability to address, and resolve, you know, harm when it's done, um, in ways that are not slavery and prison and, various other forms of oppression and exploitation. Um, and yeah, and the creativity piece as well, I think, is intrinsically tied to love as well. But I don't like. Can you? Yeah, I would love to hear your thoughts about this as well, because you formed the question, and I'm wondering what you're thinking about in relationship to that.
Hmm. That's interesting. Well, it's a question that literally just popped into my gut, and so I threw it out there. But I think that for me, I understand love. Similar to you, it's not. I think dancing in rainbows. I think was the.
How about cotton candy?
um, I understand love to be the practice of thinking of others more than myself and being able to act on that.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
if I'm doing that, I'm practicing love.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
and I think that this question that you raised around the need for leadership to be able to develop people's creative capacity, I believe was the phrase that you used. Um, I don't think that can be done without self-consciously thinking about others more than I think about myself.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that in the need of leadership to cultivate people's creative capacity, implied in that is the ability to love, to practice love, not to feel love, but to practice love.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm struck with what Sterling Tolles shared with us a few weeks ago
Mm-hmm.
when I asked him, Sterling took the position that it was more important to focus on the process than on the outcome.
Mm.
And I said, Sterling, what's it mean to focus on the process more than the outcome at a moment when the stakes are so high, when we're choosing between survival and patriarchal racial capitalism? And Sterling smiled and said, Matt, the stakes are so high because we focused on the outcome at the expense of the process.
Right. Yeah. Mm-hmm. That's true.
And I think that for me, that was such a beautiful articulation of the kind of loving approach that a loving approach to working with others. And I'm sorry, and then he went on to say, this is very important to me, that we face collective extinction because we fear individual extinction.
Mm.
And I think that that's important regarding love and this question of leadership, because somewhere in me, I get the sense that if leadership means cultivating the creative capacity of others and collectively assuming responsibility for becoming more ethical than the society that reared us, it means that leadership has to first and foremost, those people who call themselves leaders have to be thinking and acting with others in mind more than they think about themselves or act with their own interests at heart or in mind. And so for me, I think that if we're in the mess we're in, because patriarchal racial capitalism has made us so selfish. Like, I mean, I think about these folks, I think about these white people with guns in the Michigan State House.
Mm-hmm.
I think about, I saw a picture of a white woman with a poster at a rally that said, "I want a haircut." I think about, you mentioned the governor in Texas who said, "I will die for my kids to have a chance to live through the economy that I lived through." And I think about the way that we have internalized the values and modes of patriarchal racial capitalism means that collectively, now not every individual takes this position, but collectively, when faced with questions around survival or economic growth, collectively we choose economic growth.
Absolutely.
We choose suicide.
Mm-hmm.
And so it seems to me that without learning to think about other people's needs more than our own financial well-being, we can't do anything but try to go back past that is impossible to re-achieve. And so it seems to me that this question of love and leadership means that collectively it's the prioritization of your well-being. Period. And empowering, you talked about the need to empower others. And I think about the question of how people become empowered to prioritize the well-being of the whole in contrast to my personal well-being. And I don't have an answer to that, but it seems to me that that's a question that leadership for this moment must embody. Yeah. Let's go to the questions.
Let's see. Hey y'all.
So the good brother Reg Flowers, representing Brooklyn and Detroit.
What?
has posed the question, and I'm just going from the top down. Can we even get beyond the idea of others? How do we start to recognize ourselves as part of a collective we that needs to be collectively developed? Wow. COVID-19 seems to have taught a valuable lesson in that regard. I'm gonna ask that one more time. We'll repeat it. Can we even get beyond the idea of others? How do we start to recognize ourselves as part of a collective we that needs to be collectively developed? And Amaka, I wonder if you have any insights into how we recognize ourselves as part of a collective we that needs to be collectively developed.
That's a great question. I don't know if I have the answer. I feel like that's a great question for Sterling, actually, who's not here. But I do think that this particular moment, for at least some of us, because, you know, all of y'all are not really internalizing this COVID-19 thing. But, right, this idea that, you know, me sort of going out and behaving whatever which way, right, not observing social distancing, going out, doing whatever, I may or may not be a harm to myself, but it may be more important that I might be a harm to other people by doing that. And I think that this moment, right, as you raised, Reg, I think this moment, this has been a really great teaching tool in regards to this, like Matt, you were saying, thinking more about others, more about others than yourself, right? And how we practice love. And so I don't know beyond like this particular crisis or this particular, you know, COVID-19, the sort of specificities of that and what that's done to social interaction and how it's passed and everything like that. I think that's been a really great tool, but I think you're right in the sense that people need to extend that same logic to everything else, right? To the rest of our social relations. It's not just in regards to sickness, but in regards to people getting their needs met, people getting their needs met, people's ability to exercise their creative capacity, etc. Like these are collective problems, right? There are no sort of that's that one group's problems. If there are poor people in our society, that is our collective problem. And I think it's really important that we extend this same kind of logic throughout to the rest of society. I hope that we can do that and that we can really see the connections, right, beyond corona to thinking about how we relate to each other. But I don't know if you have thoughts about that, Matt.
I mean, I think, Reg, it's a beautiful question. How do we start to recognize ourselves as part of a collective we that needs to be collectively developed? And I think in regards to my personal experience, there are moments, you know, and I think, Amaka, what you said about going outside and not necessarily being a threat to yourself, being a threat to others and disregarding that. I think about.
I mean, other people disregarding that.
Yes, yeah, thank you.
I've been in the house. I have been regarding this.
Sorry, I didn't mean to put that on you. I'm sorry. But I think about times when in my past where my behavior has posed a threat to others, or has been harming to others. And I think the core of Reg's question really speaks to me, because if we have relationships with people, it creates a different container to confront and struggle with people than we're able to do with strangers or in kind of mass movement situations. You know, Amaka, if you tell me or share with me that something I've done around the house has a specific impact on you, I hear that very differently than from somebody I don't know in the street.
Mm-hmm.
And because I know that you love me and that I love you, I'm willing to hear it and then hopefully internalize it, work to internalize it and you know, work to change. And I think that for me, that this, when Reg raises the question of how we start to recognize ourselves as part of a collective we, I think that the answer has to be tied. I think there's a possibility. I don't have an answer, but it speaks to me about the importance of building relationships with strangers.
Mm.
There's a gentleman who lives down the street from us, you know, who I don't really know from a can of paint, but we speak when we see each other, and I think that, you know, when we moved to DC and began to, you know, introduce ourselves to people who had lived in the neighborhood for a long time, it transcended this notion of others towards a collective we. And so I think that the importance of trying to relate to strangers is probably, I don't have an answer, but it seems to me that that might be a place to experiment with answering the question of how we develop a collective we. You know, really having conversations and trying to connect with folks who might not agree with us on things.
Right. And I wonder if there's utility in sort of reconnecting to, um, in some ways, history and like past traditions in regards to this, because, you know, American society is very individualistic, but I think that that individualism has been further sort of deepened with, you know, thinking of like the 70s, the late 80s, or the sort of early 80s on, the quote unquote period of neoliberalism, and like the ways in which we really made public matters private. And I think that if we sort of draw from traditions and histories, even within our own families, I think there's sort of ample evidence of the importance of the collective, right? Like I think about my family and like their experience of like the Great Migration, right, and coming to the West Coast, um, and the importance of drawing upon the very large family that there was, but also just the importance of friends and other folks, you know, in the community, right? When we talk about other folks' experiences of um, the Great Migration, but also immigration, right? Think about, you know, varying forms of immigration and how people draw upon networks and community and collectives as a means to survive. Um, and so I think a lot of that is sort of shedding um, a lot of the contemporary sort of discourse and logics that we've so internalized, and really reconnecting to um, whether it's family, community, right, or historical experiences of the collective, because that's what sustained, you know, lots of communities and people for, you know, very long periods of time.
Thank you for that. Excuse me. Thank you for that. I'm seeing a question from Shane Bernardo.
Hey, Shane.
Also represent Detroit. And Shane has said, thanks for having this conversation. This talk seems very, very meta, in quotes, in the spirit of, quote, creating the places we want, end quote, personally and socially. How have you two navigated the power dynamics of being in an interracial relationship together in community and professionally? What does this look like more practically? He said, he asked us, let's talk less theory and more candidly for a moment.
I don't think I've been speaking that theoretical, but um, I feel you though. Yeah, I don't know my way. I don't know sort of best how to answer this question. It was funny because earlier today I said, Matt, someone's gonna ask us relationship related questions today, and that'll be interesting because I'm not practiced in talking about our relationship. Um, and you can jump into Matt. I think part of it for me and how I sort of perceive our relationship over the years and how it's grown, a lot of our ability to navigate problems and navigate conflict and all those different sort of things has been about one, a commitment to personally sort of, how do I phrase this? A point to be personally taking care of ourselves, right? So this idea of working through whatever trauma that's in your life or that you may be still responding to as an adult many years later, or whether it's recent or a long time ago, making sure that you're internally checking in with yourself about what your needs and what your wants are, making sure that you're clear with yourself about your values and the kinds of things that you prioritize, so that when you're coming to your partner, that you're clear with yourself about what it is that you need and require. Um, and so both sort of parties, both people doing that and being able to come to each other in that way. And then, going back to our conversation about love, um, I think both the thinking more about thinking more about your partner, um, these questions around trust, accountability, um, I think these are things that we've just worked through over the years. When we start, I mean, I guess one sort of insight, since you want us to ground this in particular ways, like when we started dating, we started reading Bell Hooks' All About Love together and used it as an opportunity for us to really unpack a lot of um, ideas, expectations, a lot of our own experiences with relationships, um, and we use that as a way to sort of connect and to be having these conversations like very explicitly with each other. Um, and so that, along with therapy and patience and right, all of these different things, I think have played a really important role. Um, and then I think that we're not ridiculous people. Like, we understand that we're an interracial couple and that we're walking through this world in a particular way, and that people have varying responses to that, and we're very aware of those sorts of things, and we check in with each other about those things. And we I think are both really, like, I think, Matt, you're pretty sort of aware and self-critical of, and sort of you recognize how you sort of navigate the world as a white man and how people perceive you in that way. And so um and how people treat you, and sort of, and so we have had conversations about like what that means for the both of us and our ability to navigate the world. But I don't know if I'm answering this question. These are just the things that are coming to my mind in response to that question. I don't quite um no, I think we're just generally really make it a commitment to be like honest with each other, honest with ourselves, and to sort of communicate, respect each other, and sort of work through conflict as it arises, because conflict is unavoidable. It happens. So, um, Matt, how would you answer that question?
Oh, I think about two, and I want to read the question again.
Yeah, me too. I'm like, I don't think I was answering this right.
How have you two navigated the power dynamics of being in an interracial relationship together in community and professionally? What does this look like more practically? I mean, I think that part of what I think you and I each bring to the table is an understanding of where you and I as individuals end,
Mm-hmm.
and the rest of the world begins.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think about one time being on a subway train in Chicago, and there was an older white woman looking at us like, we were the devil incarnate.
People look at us crazy all the time.
Yeah.
Don't get it twisted.
And I think about a moment. There's one on a train ride in Brooklyn when we lived in Crown Heights, and then we moved to DC. And I think that one of the things that you and I each do, because we know where we end and the rest of the world begins, is that when things, when we experience, when we have experiences like that, without much effort, we talk about it and then let it go.
Yeah, we address it. It's not like something that just something happens and we just sort of sweep it under the rug. Like we absolutely address it, and we address it in that moment too.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah. And I think that is the case. I mean, I think that each of us is pretty comfortable in saying that, there's not a moment any person of any racial background walks down the street in this country and it's not about race. Race doesn't play a role. Mm-hmm. Like it's just that big a part of the social reality. And so it's a matter of us accepting that. And when we feel it come up socially, we talk about it right then and there.
Yeah, and I think part of it too, I mean, if we're thinking about other, I mean, I don't know if this is about sort of other interracial relationships. I tend not to like compare our situation to that, because sometimes those are forged and some else. And I can't really speak to like what's happening in other people's relationships. But I think one thing is that, a lot of white people, because they're white and they're socialized as white people, they're socialized to see the world through a different way. And I think that if I have my experience or whatever of racism or whatever else, you believe me and you trust that experience, as opposed to maybe another white person being like, well, are you sure it was about race? I don't know. Maybe it's because it was a Thursday, or, whatever, and like that's, a lot of conflict, I think, in some of those relationships deal with like, white people bringing their race, their sort of ignorance about the world into the relationship. And I don't think we have that problem because of the work that each of us has done. And I think that you have done, Matt, over a lifetime, even before you entered the relationship. But also just sort of further commitments since we've been in the relationship. So that has not been an issue for us. Our biggest conflicts have not been related to race or anything like that. They've been the sort of normal relationship conflicts. So
largely my lack of being of being less clean than would be optimal.
We have different standards for that. But anyway, so it's just those sorts of normal sorts of things. So yeah, I hope that answers that question. All right, you have additional?
There's one more here that Reg Flowers again asked an earlier question that I think is really significant. He says, I've been focusing on recovery principles recently and wonder what your various thoughts are on the necessity of recovery/healing work as a part of social transformation. I'm thinking about, for example, the role trauma may currently be playing, unquestioned, in movement spaces versus inhabiting space in the understanding of our own need for healing and transformation. So I'm going to read that once more. I've been focusing on recovery principles recently and wonder what your various thoughts are on the necessity of recovery/healing work as part of social transformation.
Yeah, no, trauma absolutely is playing in a role in movement spaces because it's playing a role in the rest of the world, and we're part of the world, and so that's absolutely happening. And I think that we do need to prioritize healing and recovery from trauma. I think that looks different for different people. I don't think there's a one size fit all sort of process of healing. Um, even in our own different experiences and journeys, it's like, you go through things, you work on it, and then you come to a new understanding, and then you think that you've healed or recovered from something, and then come to find out it's reared its head again. You're like, I thought I dealt with this. Why is this coming back? And so I say that to say, like, I think it can look different for different people, but I do think that it should be centered. It should be addressed, I think, in movement spaces. I don't know collectively what that looks like, right? In this context of our conversation about collective, I think it requires um, maybe some collective generosity and some collective like patience with folks, right? And again, like this question, like I said, about people will harm. That's not like we can't build a world in which people will not harm. People will harm. We have to find ways to deal with that. We have to find ways to um, build sort of structures and ways for people to heal and ways for people to be accountable to that harm. And some of these movement accountability uh, experiments have been really bad too. So I don't, we need to experiment, and we need to be able to see like what works and what doesn't, and what is sort of recreating really bad experiences of shame and blame, and whatever the case may be. But yeah, I do think that there is a need to sort of collectively heal from our collective trauma, but then that also requires sort of individuals' openness and ability to deal with their own personal traumas as well. Do you have thoughts about that?
Oh yeah.
I know you have lots of thoughts about that.
I mean, I think we live in a world where when faced with the choice between survival or capitalism, we choose death.
Mm-hmm.
That seems to me that and I want to be, again, like that's a collective decision. That's not indicative of every individual. Um, but I think that in a culture where that's a rational, where that's even a rational question, there's not anybody walking around who's not damaged and wounded.
Yeah.
And in need of there's not anybody who's not traumatized. I don't know how you can live in a world or a country where your access to food and housing is contingent upon money and not be traumatized.
Right.
Um, and so I think that is really, really like I think that so that and I think the path by which people recover and or heal from trauma is, it's almost like an individual journey. And that doesn't mean that collective stuff doesn't take a role. It doesn't play a role. And I think that there's another question here that I just saw that the good sister Adela Nieves Martinez, who was here last week, raised. And I think that she asked us if we might share some of our daily practices. And then she asked, how have they changed? And I think that for me, this notion of recovering from trauma, in many ways, I think it has to be an individual journey because Amaka's practices might not be useful for me, and my practices might not be useful for her. And so, and I think that for me, like nobody could make me heal.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody can sit down and say, boy, you're going to heal today. In my experience, I have only developed the willingness to face and recover from whatever wounds or traumas that I was walking around with and therefore inflicting on others when they no longer worked.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and when they no longer worked, for a lot, as you know what I mean, as a teenager, I stole a lot. And after getting arrested, I stole less. Um, it was that kind of being confronted with the way that I did things no longer worked. Um, that then I became willing to be open to questioning why I was engaged in something, and what I might need to do to change my behavior. And so I think, to be real specific, um, there was a time in my life about, I don't know, 12 years ago, 10 years ago, where, and I shared this last week, where a number of women who I was in organization said, look, you're not living what you preach. Um, and I heard them. And within a few months, I developed the willingness to ask, why do I behave this way that clearly has this negative and hurtful impact on others? And then once I was given an answer into why, I developed a set of practices to address that. And so I think that every time I've got to get to Adela's question, today I meditate, I pray every day. I have a conversation with my inner child every day, and oftentimes check in throughout the day with my inner child. Um, and my prayer and meditation routine is pretty much one thing until I hit a wall. And then, so for example, 2 years ago, I began to pray for help becoming more committed to being useful than I was to being comfortable. And I began to do that when you and I, Amaka, had made a decision to leave New York. And I knew that if I was more committed to my own comfort than I was to being useful to others, I was just going to be a jerk for the last year we were in New York. And so whenever I become aware of a new problem, I talk to people and develop a new practice that I think, or experiment with a new practice that might help me through whatever new problem emerges over the course of my life.
I think, sorry, can I jump in real quick?
I'm done.
I think, particularly in relationship to Reg's question, which I'm still tossing around, I think something that I've thought about is, in terms of collectively, I think we have to collectively be willing to be vulnerable with each other. That's something that I am constantly working on. I'm a very guarded person. But I think we have to collectively be willing to be vulnerable with each other. I think this is especially true in home spaces. So, I always bring up the Bernice Johnson Reagan coalition politics speech, which is easily Googleable, um, which I think is a really useful work in thinking through the difference between your sort of home organization or home space versus coalition spaces, and not to go to coalition spaces expecting home and sort of expecting particular things that coalitions are there for a reason. They're sort of temporary coming together for a particular purpose, but they're not going to meet all of your needs and everything like that. They're not home. And I think for home spaces, like the willingness to be vulnerable with each other, um, the difficult reality of knowing that you probably will be hurt by somebody, and being willing to um, enter right into that, knowing that, but knowing that you can heal from that. That if the person is willing and committed to, again, being accountable and sort of, making up for harm, that that person can be okay too, and that you can work through that. But I think the importance of, again, being vulnerable, being able to trust people, those sorts of things are, I think, important in thinking about sort of collective um, capacity, thinking about collective healing and recovery. Like, I think that you have to become aware of that, knowing that you can't, of course you can be strategic and whatever, but in terms of home spaces, it's like knowing, and when you love somebody, right? It's going back to these principles of love. When you love somebody, you know that, um, that person has the potential to hurt you, that they probably will at some point in some fashion. Um, and knowing that, um, that's something that you're gonna have to work through just as human beings. That's we unfortunately we hurt each other. Um, and so I think this idea and this need to be vulnerable, I think is essential. Um, though, I don't sort of I can't claim to know that I've worked through this all through in collective spaces, but it's something I know that in my own practice of prayer, meditation, working through, um, the things that I want to improve in myself, the ways that I want to grow, and the sort of reflections that I've done on myself and my own experience, that has been a factor. You can't. There's only so much you can protect yourself from. So that's something that came to mind when reflecting on Reg's question. Um, yeah.
Amaka, thanks for that. And I think that what I think I heard you say was that practicing love requires a willingness to be hurt.
Mm-hmm. It's gonna happen.
I want to ask, do you remember when you accepted that as a part of reality?
I don't know. I don't know if I can pinpoint that. I think that I've learned that through being in relationships with people. And that's even beyond a romantic relationship. That is friendships. That's like the people that hurt you and disappoint you the most are the people that are closest to you, that you have these these close connections to. Um, so just through those relationships, I've learned that. And I think over time, I've really learned to like give people grace. Not to say that, again, some people are just habitual line steppers, don't respect boundaries, don't need to have, you don't need to keep certain people in your life, period. Some people just think you can't do it. Or, I think some relationships have seasons, right? And, sometimes you're just growing in different directions. But, I think I reflect sometimes back on situations, friendships, relationships that I had particular reactions to, like when conflict or when things were happening. And then years down the line, I look back and I can sometimes give the other folks more grace in regards to like whatever their decision making was, because I'm like, okay, like I have a better understanding. I have more perspective now. Like, I recognize the ways that I could be very difficult and again, not very guarded, not super vulnerable, etc. And what that means in a relationship and how people disengage and whatever else. And so I've been able to consider that more just as I grow, and as I continue to work on myself and reflect on my life. So yeah, I can't pinpoint a certain moment, but it's just a certain knowledge I think that I've just learned over time, that people oftentimes do the best that they can do given circumstances and whatever else. And sometimes that best is not enough in regards to the other person in the relationship. And so y'all probably don't need to be together or be dealing with each other on that point. But there are, lots of situations where people are willing to make up for harm, willing to commit to growing and to doing differently. And so, you know, anyway, it's come out through those kinds of experiences.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Amaka, it is 4:59 and we are going from 3 to 5. And I'm very grateful for the generosity of your time, your spirit,
Of course.
your brain and intellect.
I hope we answered everyone's questions, comments, or whatever.
I think we did.
Okay, good.
We did. I think we did, but I'm not the most technologically sophisticated. So if you want to take a scroll through the questions,
I think we're fine. I mean, I love y'all. Y'all are great. Looking through these comments, lots of great comments. Yeah, I think we addressed everyone's.
Okay. So I want to thank you for your time. Is there anything else you want to add?
No, thank you for having me. I hope, this was useful or provoking for folks. And yeah.
Cool. Next week, we'll be back at 3 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, 12 on the West Coast, with a woman named Amaka Agbo from Oakland, California, to talk about restorative economics and a healing race and a healing economy. And so it'll be it should be a wonderful conversation. If you want more info on Visionary Organizing Lab, you can access you can sign up for our email list on the left side of VOL's Facebook page, and you can get updates and all of that good stuff.
Shout out to your series having 2 Amakas in succession, Amaka and Nwamaka. Shout out to my Igbo sisters. So, yeah, check out next week for the other Amaka who lives in Oakland.
Yeah, and is also
from Oakland.
Right? And it's word up. So thank you, Amaka, and thank y'all for hanging out with us and for your wonderful questions and for just being a part of this. So hope to see you next week. Peace.